Good evening, mighty people, and how are you this evening? Mighty, right? I always like people to note that we are at 777 Baptist Street. How magical is that? I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you here to the Blackhurst Cultural Center and also to a different book list. And I see so many people here that we have journeyed over the years with. I'm particularly excited this evening because we are going to hear from Tony and about his book of the strikes of 1937. And just now I was thinking about strikes and unions, Tony. And my mother is with us, and my mother is 92 years strong. And so you can clap that. I want to be her when I grow up. But the reason that I thought about my mother was I also thought about the times that she worked at OHIP, and she was part of the union and organizing, and her stories, and getting, you know, the bargaining right and the negotiation right, and who you're going to talk to on the floor, and who can be trusted, and who's going to like sell you out to management. Oh my God, so much time spent in the morning and preparing to go to do battle at OHIP back in the day. So Mom, I thank you for that. And I want to congratulate Baraka Books too for his continued work in publishing, because that's not easy. Tony and Robin know how excited and pleased that we are that you chose us, because you could be somewhere else. I'm just sweating because I'm going to take the temperature down right now, but I'm having Barbados weather right now on my body. So I'm going to turn over the evening to Robin. There you go. Thank you.
My name is Robin Philpot. I'm publisher of Baraka Books. We're based in Montreal, and basically we publish, as we like to say, progressive books with an accent on Quebec. And we're really proud of our record over the last 15 years. And allow me, Miguel, to promote another book before start time, Einstein on Israel and Zionism, a new enriched edition by Fred Jerome. We brought it out because the other one had been suppressed. It's just out now, and we hope to have a launch here sometime in the future. But that's not why we're here today. Miguel has that book too. The first thing I'd like to do is thank Miguel and Itah for allowing us, inviting us here. This is what I think is the best place in Toronto. You know, I only lived here for a very short while, but when I come to Toronto, this is the place I like to come. This is a place of freedom, and you know, we're so proud to be able to launch our books here. We're lucky. We're very lucky. Then I want to thank, for this book, I want to thank Phil Taylor and the Taylor Report, who has a representative here with Pedro taking pictures, because without them, many of our books would not be promoted, and this book might not have come about. I don't know, Tony might say, he'll be able to say more about that. So I want to thank them. But a book launch is basically to celebrate the author and celebrate the book. And I want to thank Tony for having confidence in Baraka Books. We're a small publisher, but we work hard, and that is what Tony does. Tony works very hard. This book, and you'll see it, how much work has gone into it, and that's why I'm convinced the book is going to do well because of it. Because he tells a story that's been buried by a bunch of lives. It's been buried by a bunch of lives. There are a lot of factors that have led to this burying of a story. One of them is the vocabulary. Over the last 30 years, words like working class, the working class perspective that was at the heart of that strike had been eliminated. Like, in other words, Tony has rehabilitated that vocabulary. And you cannot underestimate the importance of the vocabulary, because that is a way to bury stories. I mean, we know we're talking about Palestine, we're talking about anything. What they did is they created this term middle class, which is totally, means absolutely nothing, but it's a way of basically burying the working class. And so Tony took a working class perspective about a story of people who had a working class perspective in their trade unionism. I do want to say one thing about promotion. This is not the type of book you can expect the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, CTV, and all these others, the New York Times, to talk about it. It's a bit of a subversive book. That's why I like, one of the reasons I like it is the kind of thing we like to do. But that means also that distribution and getting it known and getting into the hands of the right people takes a kind of a subversive attitude. We've got to push it, we've got to make it known, because nobody else will do that. You know, like you read in these big media, they'll cover books, but you know, when you get a beautiful coverage of it, doubt what's in the book. So this one, and what I often say in Montreal, and I would say it here, is when you're reading the book, read it in the subway. Show the cover. Because if workers are traveling on the, to work, they'll see the covers. The truth about the strike. It sounds interesting, and so there's all kinds of ways of doing subversive. And when you're going to buy it, come to a different book list, or if you're not around here, they're in the bookstores, because that is the way that keeps them going, and it keeps us going, and it keeps authors going. That's really important for it. I think it will end up inspiring unions and inspiring workers who are tired of the way the official story is about trade unions, about workers. You never really hear workers talking. And there's a strike, all you hear is the independent companies, or rarely even will they allow a union spokesman to talk about what's going on. So I think that this book will help people today, help people who are now, who are faced with the crises we're having, economic, standard of living, all these crises. A book like this will be very helpful for them. So do as much as you can to make it known. So once again, I want to congratulate Tony. I want to thank him for having confidence in Baraka Books, and long live the truth about the 37 Oshawa GM strike. And it's got a great subtitle. You get a good idea what it's about if you read the subtitle. Tony.
Thanks, Robin, and a big thank you to Itah and Miguel and a different book list for hosting us. And thank you all very much for coming. There are people here that I've known for decades and people that I've met recently, and I'm really thrilled to see all of you. I do want to recognize the people who are here who are union activists, because that is the core of what this book is about. And we have Sam Ginden from my union, the Auto Workers Union, not here for, but the CAW when Sam retired, and Herman Rosenfeld, also retired staffer from CAW Unit 4. I don't know if there's any other Unit 4 people here other than Rebecca, who is, I think, a fourth generation GM worker from Oshawa. And if you haven't met Rebecca before, you may have seen her in Company Town when we were fighting against the closure of the plant in Oshawa, and we're very thrilled to have with us tonight the producer of that film. I think it was a great film, and there's other people who are here who are members of unions. Oh, there's Mike McHugh, who's a former Chrysler worker, so retiree from my union. There's Fred Hahn, who I think everybody here knows, who's been under tremendous attack because of the courage and forthrightness and his ability to articulate the crucial issues, including solidarity with Palestine and a fight to end the slaughter that's going on in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza. Fred has shown that it's the labor movement who can lead that fight. We have Ron Meswak, who's a former postal worker. We have, I also want to recognize CIUT as a community radio station, and the Taylor Report, and Pedro and Phil Taylor, who has touched on all of these issues. I don't know if are there other union members that I've missed that should want to recognize themselves? If not, I'm going to. Oh yes, of course, Carolyn from Steelworkers. Thank you. I was talking to Carolyn before. I'm not doing very well at remembering everybody, but I appreciate you all being here. And I'm going to try to not take too long reviewing some of the information from the book, some of the themes of the book. One of the themes is about working class democracy. I think that a number of you might have another democratic exercise in your mind these days with an election that's coming up south of the border from us. But I think that it's pertinent to remind you of what Eugene Debs said in 1901 about elections in the United States. He said, "The old parties are simply two wings of the same capitalist vulture." And I think that's true today as it was in 1901. But the democracy I want to talk about, and that I think we can learn from this strike, is democracy of the working class exercising their power. And since the working class is the majority of society, that is real democracy. So the strike in 1937, I think that most people recognize, was an historic event in Canadian labor history. If you look at the details of it, the degree of organization, the degree of activism and engagement of the ordinary workers of that strike is what's really important to remember. And it was a short strike. It was 16 days, but the number of obstacles that they faced in that period of time is quite phenomenal. They were facing the most sustained, aggressive, and hostile intervention in a union's bargaining by a provincial premier ever that I'm aware of. And Mitch Hepburn, and he was a Liberal, he tried to get the RCMP involved. When that didn't work, he set up his own special police or private militia. He was up in the legislature prior to the strike while the organizing was going on, praising a mob of vigilantes who had brutally attacked sit-down strikers at Holmes Foundry in Sarnia, to send a message that that's how he wanted to deal with the organizing going on in Oshawa. And he did everything that he could to prevent workers from achieving a recognition of their union and the demands that they were after, largely because of his ties with the mining industry, his ownership of mining stock, and his ties with the barons of industry who owned mines in Northern Ontario, and did not want to see a fighting union, which is what the CIO and the UAW represented, did not want to see them successful in Oshawa, and particularly beyond Oshawa. The media was fully behind Mitch Hepburn, and he used an incredible effort at creating a hysteria, anti-communist hysteria, to try and turn people against the strike. At one point he said he had definite information that thousands of communists were gathering to go to Oshawa. And he did everything he could, but it was the most peaceful strike you can imagine, because the community was behind the strike. The strikers were organized. They had their own security detail. And I don't think that there was one single incident during the whole course of the strike. And so he was not successful in doing that. So why were the workers able to be successful when you consider the obstacles they were facing? The first factor that I think is critical is that they understood organizing workers as a class, not as a group of workers at one particular location, but as a class. They recognized that the strength of workers is at the point of production. And they carried out a strategy that meant that they were able to leverage that power in order to succeed. They believed in international solidarity, the solidarity of workers beyond this country to the United States and beyond that. And they believed that the rank and file had to be in the forefront, had to be in control of everything that was done. And those four factors, I believe, are the keys to understanding their success, and they did not happen by accident. We should never think that it was an accident. It was a plan and a strategy that was carried out by people who knew that that was what was needed. A lot of the reason that we don't know the details and the history of this strike is because it was misrepresented by the guy who became the accepted historian of the strike, Irving Abella. He wrote the book, basically, or his book was the one that was recognized and promoted, although there was other work that was better. And he gets things wrong, and critically, his account does not allow us to understand the sources of the victory of the workers at Oshawa. Some of the things he missed were the role of stewards in this strike. And I'm going to come back to that. It's really incredible. He completely ignored the role of women, both women strikers and women supporters of the strike, the women's auxiliary, or ladies auxiliary, it was called at the time. And there are important things that he got wrong. He got wrong the role of the Reds, the left wing, the communists, both before and during the strike, who developed the principles, organization, strategy, and tactics that were necessary. That, by the way, is the subtitle of William Z. Foster's book, American Trade Unionism. And he got wrong, completely wrong, the role of the UAW, which was part of the CIO, and internationalism. Let's talk about stewards first. Abella used the word stewards, but he misconstrued it. He thought that the bargaining committee were the stewards. The bargaining committee was 8 people in Oshawa. But he missed, apparently, something that was very obvious if you read the news accounts of the day, that when the strike started, the organization was in the hands of 300 stewards and 52 chief stewards. Now try to get your heads around that. I had a hard time as a union activist getting my head around that in a workplace of 3,700 people, almost 1 in 10 were a union official that was carrying out the day-to-day activity and debates and strategizing that allowed this strike to be successful. And you can see in story after story that was in the media that there were meetings of these 300 shop stewards almost on a daily basis during the strike, including up to the last day when they were the body that put the seal of approval on the agreement that was achieved. So how could that be missed? It's either you don't understand the importance of it, or you're trying to cover something up, I think. Think about the communication that's involved. If you have a steward for every 10 or 12 people, that they know those people. They're in day-to-day contact with them. They're educating them. They're organizing them. They know what their issues are. It's a two-way communication. It creates a living, breathing, live union. It's not some leaders up here and workers waiting to be told what's happening. And it was based on the shop floor. The idea of the stewards is that there would be 1 steward for every supervisor. So every supervisor, and the supervisors were brutal in the auto plants in those days in terms of driving people. They could fire people on spot. They hired people only if they gave them favors of all kinds. It was an incredibly corrupt and dictatorial system. And you could be fired if you looked the wrong way, if the supervisor didn't like you, or if the supervisor had a job for a relative. So they had 1 steward for every supervisor to take on that supervisor. And this was in place before the strike, before the union was organized, before it was recognized. And they were so strong that they were dealing with problems or grievances and getting solutions to them before the strike happened. There was a wonderful incident that I learned about a month into the organizing effort. The stewards held a banquet to recognize the stewards, and it's covered in the media, at least in the Oshawa media. This was a real significant group that was critical to the success of the strike, and it was the stewards that met and made the decision to go on strike when they did. And then they organized all of the events of the strike, the picketing and picket line support. If you read everything that Abella has written about this strike, the accepted expert on it, he never once mentions women. You could read all of his stuff and you would not know that there were any women workers in that plant. And there were over 300 of them. And there was also an organized group of women who were not workers who were supporting the strike, the auxiliary. And Abella doesn't mention that. And I don't know how you could miss it, because this is the front page of the Toronto Star during the strike. They were there picketing and marching, and that was obvious to everybody. They were at the meetings. And this is a meeting of the Auto Workers Local 222, okay? My local union, Rebecca's local union, in 1937 during the strike. And you can see the number of women who were there. They were always asked to sit at the front. So some of the pictures that have been publicized don't show the people at the front of the hall, and you would think there were no women there. But this picture shows them, as does this one. Fantastic shot. And of course, because there were a steward for every supervisor, there were many women stewards. And their pictures and their names were in the newspaper. You can't miss it if you look. There's 3 of the women stewards on the bottom right. There's 3 more at the top of that picture. And at the bottom of this picture, that picture is from the stewards' banquet, by the way. And at the bottom of the picture, you see Gertrude Gillard, who was the representative on the bargaining committee, one of the 8 people on the bargaining committee, a woman representing the women workers. And there's a picture of her with the whole bargaining committee and with the union's lawyer, J.L. Cohen, that some of you may have heard of. He was a fairly noted guy at the time, played an important role. And she was part of all of the bargaining that went on. So how can you miss her? There's another picture of the bargaining committee. And there's an interview with the Toronto Star where she was interviewed and talked about the strike and her views about the strike and the leadership of the union and the views of the women. And she also talked about the views of women who were married to strikers. So that was there. I mentioned the Women's Auxiliary, which is something that started in earlier. It was a major feature of the Flint sit-down strike, which had occurred and was successful mere days before the launch of the organizing effort in Oshawa. And that idea was brought to Oshawa, and they played an important role. The auxiliary carried on until just a few years ago in Oshawa, and had a very long and important history. So how did Abella get things wrong, or why did he get things wrong? Did he have an agenda? This is an article that he had printed back in 1972 in Canadian Dimension, and he calls the title is "The CIO Reluctant Invaders," and they were neither reluctant nor invaders, but I think that portrays his outlook and what is wrong with his outlook. He had ideological blinders, ignoring women in the strike and ignoring stewards. There's a commonality there. The commonality is that those were defining features of left-led unions. And that's something that clearly Abella had an antipathy towards. It was part of his anti-communism. Here's an indication of Abella's outlook. He says, the average union member, as almost all studies of the labor movement has shown, plays an unimportant role in the affairs of his union. What a disgraceful view of working people that he had. But it explains why he didn't really care about stewards or what the ordinary workers were doing. He also had a very negative role of the left. He talks about the unity group, some few dozen men, he says, who met secretly and regularly to discuss ways of improving working conditions. And this was a group that included members of the Communist Party, the Independent Labour Party from Britain, and a number of other people. He says, though they probably would have achieved little in any case, they spent most of their time debating the virtues of socialism and communism. Understandably, they achieved nothing. Nothing could be further from the truth, of course. It's complete disdain, and it's completely false. There was a long period of organizing prior to the strike in 1937. Really started in 1928 when a strike occurred in the Oshawa plant that was not successful because of the leadership of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. But the people who carried on the organizing from 1928 on, most of them were communists or affiliated with the Communist Party or socialists of one form or another. And the way that they organized was in the community. They organized the unemployed during the Depression. They organized ethnic organizations and fought against any kind of discrimination. They formed the Canadian Labour Defence League. They had anti-fascist demonstrations. And this is a time when they were facing great repression. There were people who were getting fired, of course, during the Depression. There were people who were being jailed. There were people who were being deported because of their political or union activities. And despite that, they carried on, and as historian John Manley said, maybe they didn't build the UAW in Canada wholly, but they can be credited with laying most of its foundation. And Abella pretty much ignores them or writes them off. Another indication of his political outlook is that while he became quite acclaimed for his books and articles about the Oshawa strike and about the CLC, he left the field of labor studies by the end of the 1970s because he felt the field had become dominated by the ultra-left and anarchists and scholars who demeaned the field. So he went on to what he felt were bigger and better things, I guess. In terms of his view of the international union at that time, the UAW-CIO, he said the union was totally bankrupt, and the men now realized, this is near the end of the strike, that they had been bamboozled by Homer Martin. He was the international president of the union at the time. Homer Martin's lavish promises. Well, the word bamboozle, of course, carries a lot of weight. It's an allegation of dishonesty, and I found lots of evidence that is completely unwarranted. He said the CIO played no actual role in the strike and that not a penny of aid came from the United States. And what he also said the CIO connection was as harmful as it was helpful. And his argument there is if there had been a different kind of union, they wouldn't have faced such hostility from the Premier, Mitch Hepburn. Well, sure. If you have a union that's not rocking the boat, that's not going to achieve progress for workers, that's going to play the middle role, yeah, maybe you'll be more successful with the Premier, but you won't be more successful at winning what the workers need. There was tremendous contributions from the UAW as part of the CIO, and including the organizer who came from the UAW, Hugh Thompson. And Hugh Thompson, whenever he wrote about the strike, always credited his wife. They were a team, they organized together. Bella doesn't mention that. The contributions included the leadership of the UAW in the United States bargaining over the Oshawa strike in Detroit with the heads of GM Corporation, who of course were over the subsidiary in Oshawa. They had people on the payroll. They visited there. Homer Martin, when there were 18 sit-down strikes occurring on one day in Detroit because of the aftermath of the Flint sit-down, Homer Martin came to Oshawa twice during the strike to support the workers there. On one occasion, he did this most incredible thing from Oshawa of setting up a conference call with all 45 local presidents of all of the UAW locals in the US that represented GM workers. Might have been the first conference call in Canadian history, but in any event, just an amazing thing. At the UAW Executive Board, and I went and looked at the minutes, Abella said he looked at the minutes too, but he didn't quote this part. Homer Martin told the board the most acute situation that the International Union is faced with at the present moment is the Oshawa, Ontario strike. They pledged their support. They had plans in place to collect $100,000 from the US GM workers, $1 apiece. And they gave very stern warnings to GM that if there was any attempt to import cars from the US to Canada or to replace Canadian auto sales to the British Commonwealth, which were important at the time, that there would be an immediate strike in the US. You probably can't see this, but it's a calendar showing all of the events during the strike, times when the UAW General Executive Board was discussing the strike or bargaining with GM, all the times that the stewards met, at least the times that where the meetings were reported in the press. They probably met every day. There were meetings of the membership, often 3,000 people during the strike, day after day, where they dealt with every crisis during that strike, and there were many, every twist and turn. And it was the members who made the decisions, and that's why they were able to be successful. So I guess the last point is the relevance of this strike to the work we're doing today as people who believe in social justice, as people who are parts of the labor movement. And I think I'll throw that out to all of you, and I'm happy to hear comments or questions, and I'll respond to them. And Robin is going to be the MC. I would ask people to introduce themselves when they're speaking, so we can all get to know each other. And if you need a drink of juice or something, a snack, please, feel free to go and grab it.
Thank you, Tony. He tells the story well, but he tells it even better when you read it. I mean, the story of the strike, it's like a novel, somebody said, but I tell you, I haven't read it 2 or 3 times, it is really a good read about the strike. So, anybody who has questions or comments?
Thanks, Tony. That was really terrific. Really look forward to reading it. I just 2 things that
Introduce yourself.
I'm sorry,
The
Sam.
people at the back can't see.
Yeah, sorry, Sam Ginman.
Thanks.
It's interesting how the continuity in the labor movement can very easily be missed. You lose a strike and people are down. People who studied who were key stewards in Oshawa found out that a lot of them were in the general strike in Winnipeg in 1919. And they got blacklisted, so they had to leave. And they ended up in Oshawa, and they worked. And then all of a sudden something happened, and they emerged again. And that's how history unfolds. The other thing, which I'm sure you talk about more in the book, it wasn't just the kind of concrete, visiting Oshawa that was key, or giving them some money. It was the inspiration. It was the idea that this was possible. And that was the great thing that the Americans did at that time, which was so absolutely crucial. And that kind of inspiration, when there's struggles, flows across the whole labor movement. It doesn't have to just be in your sector. Anyways, thanks a lot, Tony. This is really terrific. And you have to get this book out of the way to the Americans. They've got a good opposition
Working
group
on
there.
that, yes.
And yeah, they'll love it.
Tony, David DePaul. I'm a life member of the Elementary Teachers Union of Ontario. And have you heard of any examples, modern examples, of the rank and file organizing that you talk and write about here? We've used a model for steward training by Jane McElgee, who unfortunately died recently, but sounds, rank and file empowerment. Have you heard yourself known of any modern versions of it like that?
Teachers are an interesting group, and I'm sure you're fully aware of the Chicago Teachers Association, which
That's where our inspiration came from.
yeah, and I think they've done incredible things, and I think there are lots of examples, small and large, of this kind of organizing. But what's really critical is for us to spread awareness of that and make sure that we are setting up the basic principles as a model or as a guide that we can follow. Not the details, because the details will be different in different workplaces or different unions, but the underlying principles of wanting to engage in a democratic way the entire membership of the union and empowering them and allowing them or helping them to develop and exercise their real power that they have in the workplace, which is the fundamental power that workers have. Those are the fundamental principles. And that's why I started out by talking about what is really fundamentally democratic. It's workers exercising that power. So thanks for that question.
Another question? Yes.
I'll try and speak loud.
Get a mic. Get a
My
mic.
name is David Sobel. I worked off and on for the CAW in the 80s and 90s, and in 1987, we were hired by Local 222, we being Carl Beveridge here, myself, the late Carol Conde, and Rosemary Donegan, to do an exhibit to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the strike. And from what I recall, there were several panels that talked about the auxiliary, talked about the community, and I actually tried to track it down several years ago, and it seems to have disappeared. So you might want to ask someone at the local what happened to it. Use it in your exhibit and book launch.
I do want to give great credit to the late Carol Conde and Carl Beveridge for that work, which I saw when it first came out. And I did say that there were people who had written about some of this stuff, but that it hasn't become as recognized as Abella's tale. And unfortunately, one of the things that Carl and Carol did is they interviewed some 30 or 40 members, some of the original members of Local 222, and those interviews are an incredibly rich source of understanding what was going on at the time. And I made great use of those interviews in my own research and in this book, so they certainly should be credited for that.
Next question? Comment? Okay.
My name is Chris Lee, and I'm a former UAW 222 when I was a teenager. But anyway, I'm wondering if in your book you talk about the music of that strike.
The music.
My grandmother wrote the start song. She was the president of Ladies of the Very Good Thing. She got her money. I don't know at that point.
Can you sing it?
My mom was come to see this tonight. But I know my grandmother wasn't involved with the music. She talked about that when I was a
This is why we meet like this, because we learn things from each other. I didn't know about the strike song, and I would love to know more about it. If you could pass any information my way. Music, of course, was a huge part of organizing in the labor movement from the 19th century, from the Wobblies in the early 20th century, and all the way through. And you know, we all still sing Solidarity Forever because of the way that it crystallizes the principles that we believe in such a powerful way. But I would love to learn more about that. I did not know about it. Thanks for mentioning it.
Hi, Tony. I'm Herman Rosenfeld. Have you been challenged with, from this perspective? I mean, it isn't exactly so popular around to argue that you know, that left radicals played a big role in building the union, and that the solidaristic relationship between the CIO, UAW, and us here was precursors, was something that was real. So I can't believe that you know, that there aren't people that have challenged me. That's not necessarily the best.
Just today, tomorrow is the pub day. The book is officially out tomorrow.
I'm looking forward to those challenges, but no, not as of yet. But I hope that we and I hope that all of you can help us get wider circulation for this book. But it deserves challenge because it's a challenging work. It's not accepting what the perceived wisdom has been, and you know. So I hope that we can really spark some discussion and debate about these issues, because I think that will be helpful.
We'll just pause for the questions. Chris Glover, the NDP MPP for Spadina and North York. Yeah, just walked in. His father worked at Local 222 for GM in Oshawa, and his grandfather was one of the founding president, if I'm not mistaken, founding member of the union in Oshawa. So thank you for coming, and perhaps you'd like to say a few words, or we'll just finish the questions and then you can say something.
Finish the questions, and I'll say a few words.
Okay. Is there a comment, question?
Hi Tony, my name is Fez Ahmed. I'm staff at QB Ontario. I've been with Fred quite a bit. Question around the pre-war sort of setting that 1937 provides, and juxtapose that to effectively like what we can say might be a bit of a parallel in terms of where we see the world today. While you were doing your research on this, did you come across any anti-war mobilizing, any sort of minutes around where the union was around the question of the war and what the general sort of atmosphere was like around it?
Yeah, there is a bit in the book about the organizing that was going on during the 1930s, during the Depression, and a big part of it was trying to mobilize people against fascism. There was the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion of Canadians who went to support the Republican, the socialist, basically government of Spain from the attack by Franco's attempt for a military coup in alliance with Hitler. And there was big demonstrations against fascism. One of them was in Oshawa less than a year before the strike. And at that time, the organizing was not as far along, and GM was able to mobilize some people who I think were part of their sports teams that they sponsored to go and threaten the people who were speaking in the park at a rally against fascism and basically break it up. They were so violent. But within a year, that turned around. So yes, that kind of international perspective and identifying fascism as a threat that everybody should be concerned about was part of the organizing effort.
Another question or comments? Yes.
Tony, could you, Rebecca Keach, could you clarify a little bit about why the steward's body was so exciting when you found out about it and how it's different than what we may think of right now?
Well, the excitement it came from just being knocked off my chair because I had no idea. I did know that in the history of our union that there had been a greater importance given to stewards in the past, but I never imagined that it was to that degree of 300 stewards in a plant of 3,700 people. In terms of how things are now, at some point, I think probably in the 1960s, I couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but at somewhere around there, the stewards were eliminated in favor of full-time committee people. And that's what we have. It's stayed the same, both in the United States and in Canada since that period of time. And it's a ratio of 1 to 250, is what it says in our collective agreement. So instead of having a workplace full of union activists, and they've been called the army of stewards because in a lot of cases they were an army taking, to lead the battle against the corporation. Instead of that, we've now had for 60 years a system where somebody gets elected to a position where they don't have to work at all. The stewards worked, by the way. They were working stewards. They were only off the job if they were dealing with a grievance or a problem. The rest of the time they worked along with everybody else. So we eliminated that system in favor of people who are full-time, so they're getting perks of different kinds, usually overtime, extra overtime as well, so extra money. They're separated from the workforce. They're not in the same kind of daily contact, and there's far, far fewer of them. And so one rep for every 250 people, it's not the same. It's a bureaucratic system rather than a living, fighting organization. And by the way, in Oshawa, at least, and it wasn't the same everywhere, but in Oshawa, we never had stewards in the collective agreement. There were stewards because the union said we're going to have stewards. They were not in the collective agreement, not in 1937, not ever. But they were there at least until 1955 because the union said we're going to have stewards. And by the way, that's something I think people should think about now. You don't have to wait until you get permission because a steward is a representative of the union. The union can have whatever representatives they want.
Any more questions or comments? Just, yeah, okay.
I spoke already, so if anybody else wants to.
Then we'll invite.
I just wanted to give an example which really comes from David Sobel, who discovered these two movies that General Motors made, 36, 37. And it really tells us a lot about how much the company actually understood what was going on. In 1937, they made a film, and the whole film is about the glory of hands, of workers making things. This is before the unions there. And then the Flint happened. They canned that film. They made another film, and then in that new film, the worker was a consumer. You don't see him go into the factory, you don't see anything in the factory. He comes home and he goes shopping. And they completely got that you had to change the way of thinking about workers from producers to consumers. That was the key, to individual consumers.
Thank you very much. By the way, this would make a good film. It reminds me of The Salt of the Earth, which was a great working class story with women involved, and it would. So we'll try and get it brought to made into a film. Chris Glover, please. Thank you for coming.
Okay. Yeah.
Hey,
Thanks.
nice. So my name is Chris Glover. I'm the member of Provincial Parliament for Spadina Fort York. I met Tony last spring, and he was telling me about this book that he was writing, and it's a big part of my family history. My brother works at General Motors. When they shut down the plant a few years ago, he was one of the last 300 workers there. My father worked there. My great-grandfather was building horse carriages for the McLaughlin Carriage Company when they switched over to cars. My uncles, aunts, my grandmother worked there from the age of 14 to 18, and then she married my grandfather, and they weren't allowed to have spouses working for the company, so she had to quit. Anyway, I mean, obviously we've come a long way. But this strike in 1937, I remember my grandfather telling me about this, and he was determined to help this union. So when the organizer came knocking at the door of the house, he signed up immediately. His card was number 4. And so he always talked about, this is the 4th card for the union. And I will say my great-grandfather, my grandfather lived in real poverty until the union. Like my father grew up in a house, he was born in 1932. He's now 92, he's still here. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, let's give Mike a shout out. Okay. He was a tool and die maker. And my uncle's an electrician. Everybody works. I don't know, it's a one industry town that when I was growing up, there were 60,000 people in the city. 18,000 worked at General Motors. Now, not everybody worked, some people were coming from Whitby and other places, but still, disproportionately, everybody worked at General Motors. And it's so important that we capture this history, because my father, when he grew up, I was just saying, he grew up in a shack. There was no running water. There was a well in the back. There was an outhouse in the back. That's the way he lived till he was 15. And in 1937, when they unionized, they started to get decent pay. And then, the spread of the industrial unions led to the creation of the middle class, or the expansion of the middle class in Canada, till it encompassed the majority of people. And the privilege that I grew up with was the privilege of growing up in a unionized family with a good middle class income. And so we had a car, and we had indoor plumbing, and we had a trailer, that we hauled down to Florida and up to the East Coast and places. We lived a good life because of the unionized movement, because of that strike in 1937. And I will say also, the lesson that I learned from it was, it wasn't a foregone conclusion when they tried to organize. And I'm sure, you've already probably heard tonight about Mitch Hepburn, the Liberal Premier at the time, and the Hepburn's Hussars, or the Sons of Mitches, that were going to go and actually beat up my grandfather and all the other guys who had signed the union card. And thank God, his cooler heads prevailed. His wife was going to leave him. 2 cabinet ministers stepped down from Hepburn's cabinet because they knew that if you send in these goons, people are going to die, because that was what was happening in the States. And so they didn't, and then we got the union. And then, the expansion of the unionized, this was the first industrial union in Canada, and it spread. And so, it led to us, my generation growing up in real, in a good middle class income. And I see many people here with gray hair like myself, and I look at, we really peaked in the 1980s. And since then, neoliberalism has taken over, and we're now on a downward trend. And I look at this next generation of young people, and we've got to teach them the lessons from 1937 and the fight, the solidarity fights, because we've got to make sure that they also have a positive future. Because right now, they're despairing, and they're looking everywhere for solutions. And I'll tell you, the solution is not, with the current government, this forward conservative government. It actually terrifies me. I mean, one of the stats that I won't talk too much longer. But I'm pretty passionate about this, because my son just moved to Regina. He took a job in Regina. He loves Toronto, he loves Ontario, but he took a job in Regina and says, I can't see a future for me here in Ontario because I'll never be able to afford a house. And so we've got to get back to, building affordable housing, building co-ops, building social housing, building supportive housing, so that we bring an end to the intenting cabinets. And this is the same kind of organizing. We've got to make sure that all of our workers are organized so that people aren't living in destitution. We've got to make sure that, you know, we're not bringing in temporary foreign workers to bring down wages here. That we're only, and that temporary foreign workers are treated with dignity like all workers should be treated with dignity. So I want to thank Tony for capturing this history, because this is a history that needs to be taught to this generation and future generations so they know what it takes to actually fight for a decent life for ourselves and for our families.
And Chris, and Chris touched on a couple of important issues, and one of them was Hepburn's attempt to create a special police or militia to, and I'm sure that his goal was to try to provoke violence, but it didn't work because the strike was so peaceful. But the response of the workers when Hepburn was, he recruited some students, but he also recruited some veterans to be part of this group that as Chris said, was referred to as Hepburn's Hussars. The response of the workers was to organize this parade, I've got up on screen here, of members of the union who were veterans. And so they're wearing their caps and they're wearing their medals. There were over 500 of them. And they marched through Oshawa to the cenotaph to lay a wreath, and then they passed a motion to send a letter to Hepburn telling him in no uncertain terms that they were not going to allow him to use veterans against other veterans and destroy their attempt to organize a union in Oshawa. It was very, very successful. I also wanted to read, and the other point that you made, Chris, that I think is critical is the unions were founded, and certainly the union in Oshawa was founded so that workers could have a decent life, a decent standard of living, and a pension when they retired, a secure retirement. And we've gone so far backward that the majority of workers now don't have a defined benefit pension. And have, we've given up so much. So yes, we do have to get back, and the only way to get back is through having unions that are prepared to fight to improve things, not to hold on, but to fight for what workers need and deserve. And when the strike was won in Oshawa, there was this quote, I want to find this quote to read. It came from the Daily Clarion, which was the paper of the Communist Party. Yesterday's shift, the first since the strike closed the plants 19 days ago, saw union members working under considerably improved conditions. They could look forward, among other things, to a larger pay envelope next payday. Older hands were back on the job with confidence that their seniority rights would be maintained, that the company no longer has the right to fire older workers and hire new men without consulting the union. More than that, they saw their first day with unionism on the job, with shop stewards watching assembly lines and checking up with the foreman on maintenance of all clauses in the agreement. So that's what the union achieved, and it's still, in many cases, what we need to achieve again, where we have slipped on those things.
So thank you very much for attending and for the questions, and we invite you to share the food and the drinks that are there. Thank you.
Just one word to let you know that we have a 10% discount in the book. So the book tonight is $23.58. So buy as many copies as you like. And Tony will be signing right here at this table.
Sure.